Okay, hello Year 11 Extension 1. This is just a short video just to introduce the next topic that we're doing in Extension 1. This topic is called Graphical Relationships. Now, in the topics that we've been doing in Advanced and also Extension 1, we've been looking a lot at graphing functions. So far we've looked at the graphs of a few different types of functions. So we first started out by looking at what the graphs of linear functions were. So we remembered what linear functions, they just formed a line on a Cartesian plane. And we drew linear functions. Then we moved on to quadratics, and we did quite a bit of work in Advanced graphing quadratic functions. And so they formed a parabola. Then we briefly, at the end of last term, looked at cubics. And so we did cubics functions. And so cubic functions, they have a weird shape like this, or they kind of look like a weird S sometimes. And then at the start of this term and also last term when we were looking at in Extension 1, we looked at polynomials a bit. And so this term we looked at graphing polynomials, and we found that they made these weird, kind of depending on what degree the polynomial had and what the factors were, they had like weird shapes that we could come up with for polynomials. And then in Advanced, most recently, we've been looking at reciprocal functions. And so I have, no, they're not called reciprocal functions, they're called hyperbolas. So hyperbolas, where you've got 1 over x and you've got these two branches that make up the hyperbola. And we've also looked at, what was the last one we looked at? We also looked at, yes, absolute value functions very recently. So absolute value functions, they kind of look like a big old V. And we had a look at that at the start of this year when we were looking at absolute value functions in Extension 1. Now, what this topic is looking at, what this topic is looking at is basically going, well, we have all these functions that we know how to graph. What happens if we change it up a bit and play around with these functions and do a few funky little things to them? So what we're going to actually look at is how to use these, based off these functions, graph different functions based off of the type of shapes by doing a few different transformations. And we're going to go through a few of them. So I've got 4 arrows here. These are 4 broad areas that we're going to be looking at in this topic. The first one that we're going to be looking at is looking at the reciprocals of functions. So this is very similar to the hyperbola things, hyperbola functions that we've been looking at in Advanced. Basically what this looks like is we're taking 1 over a function. So here we're going y is equal to 1 over f of x. So that's the first type of function that we're going to be looking at in this topic. The next type of function that we're also going to be looking at, and just to give you a bit of overview with what is happening in this topic, is we're looking at what happens when we take the square root or we square a function. So square rooting and squaring a function. So for example, we're going to be looking at what happens when we go y squared is equal to f of x, or y is equal to square root f of x, or what happens when we go f of x squared. We're looking at what this does to our function based on the ones that we've already looked at. Then we're also going to be looking at the absolute value. So what happens when we take absolute values of a function? So for example, y is equal to absolute value of f of x, or y is equal to f of absolute value of x. These ones get a little bit tricky and it gets a little bit funky. And the final type of graphical relationships that we're looking at is sum and products of functions. So what happens when we multiply and add functions together? So for example, f of x plus g of x and f of x times g of x. So what happens when we graph that type of function? I don't have a box around here that fits all this. This will have to do. Okay, cool. So this is kind of a brief overview of what this topic is going to look like. We're going to hopefully delve into this. We're going to use a bit of Desmos and a few other online kind of graphing calculators just to see what that looks like and help us out a bit. But yeah, stay tuned. This is just a nice intro for you guys, and hopefully you get a lot out of this topic.